My presentation is on the development of the Russian sitcom. So the story of the transformation of the Russian sitcom from a series of format-based copycats to products that are aimed at capturing a share of the global marketplace is one that is expressly tied to one television channel, STS, and 3 of its programs that helped it grow from a relatively small and obscure channel to one of the leading entertainment brands in the former Soviet Union. In the span of time from roughly 2004 until 2013, STS was able to take what was an almost unknown genre, and certainly an underappreciated genre, and make it the keystone of its brand and reputation as essentially the leading entertainment brand and network in the former Soviet Union. Next slide, please. In so doing, it was able to grow itself into a multi-channel, multinational entertainment brand. So today, STS operates 3 channels in Russia proper. So STS, its flagship channel, Perets, or Pepper, a male-focused channel, Domashny, a women-focused channel, Domashny, which means home, as well as an international satellite channel called STS International, which is available in Germany, the Baltics, Belarus, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and in North America. A channel in Moldova called STS Mega, and a channel in Kazakhstan operated under the name Channel 31. So this ultimately represents a meteoric rise for a company that prior to 2003 essentially only rebroadcast Hollywood films. Next slide, please. The sitcom itself has experienced a parallel, if not completely dependent rise in its fortune on Russian television. And it's gone basically through these kinds of 3 steps of localization, hybridization, and cultural odorlessness, which I'll talk about in a second. So prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the genre essentially did not exist at all on Russian television. Following the end of communism, some sitcoms did start to appear on Russian television, mostly in the form of American and British programs with Russian voiceover. Well, everything from I Love Lucy and to Friends appeared in the 1990s and early 2000s, the genre had limited appeal to Russian audiences. During this period, a few Russian language attempts were made to adapt shows into the Russian language, and these were based primarily on British formats, but they were critical and commercial failures. Critics and audiences hated them for their shallowness, and most of all for the presence of the laugh track, which Russian audiences were convinced that even Americans must secretly hate. Next slide, please. This, however, changed virtually overnight when STS launched Moya Prekrasnaya Nyanya, or My Fair Nanny, an adaptation of the CBS hit sitcom The Nanny, which in the US starred Fran Drescher. The series was a co-production between STS, Sony Television International, who holds the international rights to the show, and the Russian production company A-Media, with Sony providing technical assistance and consultancy services throughout the production of the series. The series' popularity exploded, causing STS, which still could only reach about 75% of homes in Russia, to grab the highest rating share for the time slot that The Nanny aired in. The program's lead actress quickly rose up the ranks of the Russian star system and became the most popular actress in the Russian-speaking world. Because on Russian television, shows tend to run 4 or 5 days a week until they either run out of content or until the ratings decline, the series was shown Monday through Thursday throughout its entire run. The series ran for approximately 4.5 years and in that time produced 173 episodes, 27 more than the original Nanny, which actually required Sony and STS to rewrite some of the originals and kind of reorganize the series a little bit. The original scripts that they added for The Nanny were a mix of original content produced in Russia and scripts that had been rejected from the original series. And this extension of the series is really notable since it's a relative rarity when it comes to scripted formats. And it set the stage for STS to do the same thing with other programs, most notably with a show called Voroniny, which is the adaptation of Everybody Loves Raymond. And next slide, please. But the series' most notable achievement is without a doubt the fact that it opened up Russian audiences to the sitcom genre. And just here on this slide, you can see sort of a list of some of the Russian sitcoms that have been based on formats. This is not a complete list. There's probably about a half dozen more, including shows like Roseanne, which is currently being adapted for STS. But you can see the growth of the genre in general. All right, next slide, please. The second sitcom, which would eventually propel STS to greater heights, was called Papini Dochki, or Daddy's Girls. And it has the distinction of being the first truly popular original Russian sitcom. The program began showing on STS in September of 2007 and ended its run in April of 2013, having produced 410 episodes in its 5.5-year span. At its prime, the series dominated its time slot, allowing STS to significantly grow its brand. It also provided a fairly vast number of episodes that could be rerun on STS itself, which helped it to reduce its costs over time, and also for Domashny, its women-focused specialty channel. It was also relatively successfully sold abroad as a package program for voiceover and subtitling. It was sold in places like Finland, Israel, and widely through the former USSR. Next slide, please. It was also accompanied by an expansive merchandising and transmedia campaign, which included books, DVDs, clothing, kitchenware, stationery, sticker books, and 2 video games based on the series that were initially available on Windows-based PCs, but eventually made their way onto Android phones and onto the social networking site Vkontakte. This attempt at monetizing Papini Dochki as an intellectual property was by far the most comprehensive effort made by a Russian company to extract secondary value from programs that they were producing. And that remains true to this day. It remains unmatched. Next slide, please. It's also notable as one of the first Russian series ever to be sold as a format. In this case, to a German television channel, Das Vierte, or Channel 4. The formatted version of the show was ultimately unsuccessful in Germany due to poor production values and the sense that German audiences had that the humor remained too Russian. Next slide, please. That said, Daddy's Girl is a milestone for Russian television, both in the fact that it was the first truly popular Russian sitcom and the fact that it was the first that attempted to reach out broadly in terms of international sales and formatting. And really, the series represents STS's first serious attempt to become a content provider for anything other than Russia and the Russian-speaking diaspora. It essentially faltered because once it was localized, the series still gave off what Koichi Iwabuchi calls cultural odor, and by this he means that the cultural markers that remain in a cultural product which signal its original nation of origin. And on this slide, you can just see a few of the original Russian sitcoms that have been made since Papanidochki aired. And this is, again, not a complete list, but it does represent kind of a good cross-section of the series. Okay, next slide, please. And this leads directly into the final program that I want to discuss, a show called Kuchnia, or The Kitchen. So The Kitchen came at a moment for STS when it was beginning to give up its ratings lead, which it had built up over rival networks, particularly the state-owned network TNT, which essentially had come to prominence by copying STS's programming strategy. STS in Russian terms have been roughly described as the Coke and Pepsi of Russian television, in that their program offerings are really, really similar. By the spring of 2011, STS was starting to lose rating shares in significant ways. And its remaining television properties, particularly Daddy's Girls, were looking increasingly tired and failing to draw significant audiences. So the company needed to generate a hit to revitalize their success and to sort of fight back against their increasingly popular and aggressive rival, TNT. The decision was made at STS to produce high-quality programs, especially with regards to visuals. Among the moves that STS made to realize this was to reorganize its two in-house production units, Costa Film and Soho Media, into one unit, which they called Story First Productions. Presumably, a large part of the process was to upgrade Story First's studios so that they would be able to film higher quality series. And this was a pretty significant process, since it took about 2 years before they were able to produce content again. They also sent out a large amount of their production to an external company founded by former STS employees called Yellow, Black, and White, which took over the production of most STS shows, including Daddy's Girls. Daddy's Girls itself was retooled into an hour-long format and shifted from the sitcom genre to a dramedy, and it received a significant boost in its visuals, moving it up to HD quality, and previously it had been a 3-camera comedy with fairly low production values. The Kitchen is ultimately a partnership between STS and Yellow, Black, and White, and it's notable in a couple of significant ways. First, it has the highest budget of any Russian sitcom ever produced, at about $8 million for the first 40 episodes, about $200,000 per episode, which may not seem very significant when you compare it to American sitcoms, but in Russian terms, it actually is a very, very large budget, and STS put a lot of resources into the series. The upgraded budget for the show allowed them to produce a product which in many ways is visually on par with Western situation comedies. So the series was completely shot in 720p and a 16:9 aspect ratio to look better on HD TVs, which by 2012 were starting to dominate the Russian market. And the strategy that STS took with The Kitchen was wildly successful. Through the first 40 episodes, The Kitchen ended up being a massive rating success, with about 25% of Russians tuning in, and with a larger percent of Russians in Moscow, the most important media market, tuning in, about 33%. The third season finale of the series was and remains the highest rated single episode of television in Russian history. So, in that it's a very popular Russian series, I think it's significant on its own. However, I think looking at the way that the series has been constructed speaks to STS's strategy going forward and how it intends to form programs that could help it reach out or provide premium content outside of Russia alone. So if we could go to the next slide, please. What I have here is just a short trailer for the show, just to give you an idea of the visuals and the content And I think especially as you're just watching this, pay attention to the music that's airing. And this is actually completely representative of the show, even though this is a sales trailer that was made for MIC TV. It actually does represent what the show looks and sounds like in Russia. So if I could get you just to play the clip there.
Kitchen, a delicious comedy. This is the story about a young cook who came to conquer Moscow. He dreamed of working in the most famous Moscow restaurant, Claude Monet. And here he is. All he needs is to impress the chef.
Извините, а вы не шеф? Нет. А тебе зачем? Шеф. Шеф!
Тихо.
Вас хозяин зовет.
Хозяин? Ну что, в рабовладельческом строе живет? У него что, имени нет, а? Холоп.
Доброе утро, шеф!
Сделай средний прожар. Никогда не используй этот отвратительный коньяк. Уже готово. Мясо отбивай. Розмарин.
And this is Victoria, director of the restaurant. Relationship with Max, complicated.
You don't understand. You don't understand. Oh, it feels to love a girl someday. You wish you were a better man. You don't listen to her. You don't care how it hurts until you lose the one you wanted. 'Cause you're taking her for granted, and everything you had got destroyed.
He was ready to face anything but the kitchen's hot degree.
Извините.
Я беременна от тебя.
Хватит штаны одеть! Ох, Соловик!
Kitchen, a delicious comedy.
All right. So then that is completely what the show looks and sounds like. All of that music is from the show. In particular, Beyonce's song "If I Were a Boy" that plays during the that slightly bizarre sex scene. They licensed that for $80,000, which was unprecedented for a Russian show. And I think it should surprise no one that given the perceived lack of content, particularly in scripted fiction, in the global market today, that more and more formats are being created to fill the gap, and especially something with a proven track record is incredibly valuable on the global market. So unlike its other original sitcoms and programs, The Kitchen is really notable in that I think it is built to be exported easily, both as a subtitled or voiced over program, but I think more significantly as a format. And this preparation for export and formatting has essentially been achieved by stripping the series of as many significant cultural markers as possible that would have signaled it as being Russian. So I think the most important thing in the series is actually where it's set. So the series is set, obviously, in an upscale French restaurant called Claude Monet. And though the series is obviously set in Moscow, the fact that an upscale French restaurant, presumably also called Claude Monet, exist in any global city from New York to Beijing means that this should be easily exportable from one setting to another. Within the sets themselves, there's almost no Russian writing visible, aside from a few things like on the refrigerator. The only really significant cultural markers that appear in the series are in the chef's head office, and they're banners for his favorite football team, FC Spartak Moscow. So the setting is essentially a global one that could easily be transposed from one place to another. The other thing that I think marks the series as being culturally odorless or globally oriented rather than oriented to Russia alone is the use of non-diegetic music. So typically where Russian series have used music as theme songs or non-diegetically, they license music from Russian artists, which is relatively cheap. The Kitchen, as you saw in that trailer, uses music almost exclusively from the canon of global music. So most prominent, there's music from Beyonce, Neon Trees, Enya, OK Go, and a host of other English artists, as well as kind of culturally odorless classical music. So apart from what is in the series itself, STS has also produced 2 significant English language documents to try and market the series. So the first one is that trailer, created with subtitling and voiceover to sort of present the series. That one's I cut that one down. It's a little bit shorter. The full one runs about 6 minutes, but establishes, the feel and the characters in the series. Particularly, it's pretty impressive visuals and it's sort of pop music driven feel. The second one is a 10-page document in English that breaks down the series' performance across demographic groups, professional groups, as many sort of breakdowns as it can to show how successful this series is. And all of these are in English, for the obvious reason that English is sort of the lingua franca of the television industry. MIPCOM and MIPTV and all the international trade fairs take place in English. So it's clear, I think, that a big part of this production is meant, or is done with international sales outside the former Soviet space in mind. If I could get just the next slide, please. One of the biggest sort of news items that came from this series was that in 2013, CBS Studios International acquired the rights to distribute The Kitchen and to do formatted adaptations, basically in Western Europe, North America, and Latin America, with STS retaining the rights to the format in the former Soviet Union and Israel. And just a next slide again here. And in the past year, so in 2015 and 2016, there have been 3 adaptations of the series that have been produced in Estonia, Georgia, and Greece. So the series now has achieved more success as a format than any Russian series ever has. So while Russian companies are still net buyers of television products, programs like Daddy's Girls and The Kitchen, and the fact that STS has begun to try and sell them outside of Russia in significant ways, suggests that this is changing. STS is really important because it's always been a leader in the production of foreign genres in Russia. And now with their new international orientation, it suggests a possible shift in the Russian market towards creating these kinds of culturally odorless series. With series like Daddy's Girls, sales outside of Russia were essentially a secondary consideration, something that came only after the series had already become successful. With The Kitchen, however, you can see that foreign sales, as a canned program or as a format, are essentially part of the program's DNA. From My Fair Nanny, the adaptation of The Nanny, to The Kitchen, STS has moved in a cycle that has seen it go from a a producer only of licensed remakes to an aspiring global content provider. And I think it's really significant in that what has typically happened in the Russian market is where STS has gone first, other channels like TNT have followed. So I think depending on how well the kitchen continues to do, we may very well see Russian formats starting to enter the global market in a really significant way. And go to the last slide. Thank you very much, and I do apologize for not being there in person, but I appreciate the chance to present to you remotely.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeff. I don't know if this is working.
Yeah, I can hear you, so.
Okay, if we have one or two questions, so that we can move along.
Hi, Jeffrey. I would like to ask you, because from many of the presentations we've had here, one of the topics that kind of repeats itself is the fact that comedy, it's a little bit harder to travel than drama because of the humor that it involves and the fact that humor is quite different in many contexts. I was wondering, being that the case here, it's basically producing comedies, and in particular The Kitchen, how do they work to surpass that barrier in terms of the humor? Do they work with people in each market? What's the process if you had researched it?
Well, I think primarily what they've done, especially with The Kitchen, is they've tried to, in the sense, create as global a setting as possible and try to go with what would be considered, I think, the most universal themes that they possibly can. And I think, like, things like the setting being in a kitchen, working in the service industry in the sort of, always contingent kind of sense of, working in service industries like that. And then just, themes around, sex and love, really kind of universal themes in a lot of ways. I mean, interestingly, I show this in classes that I teach both on media and on globalization to my students, and with subtitles, of course. And they typically really enjoy the series. And when we do discussions as to what is culturally specific or what don't you get about this series, it's almost nothing. So I think they've stripped as much kind of specifically cultural humor out of this and gone with just as broad of themes as they can possibly find to avoid that problem. So I think that's, in a sense, like if you go back to something like Everybody Loves Raymond and Phil Rosenthal's experience bringing that over to Russia, it's really those universal themes and trying to keep themes as kind of non-culturally specific as possible that has the biggest impact.
Well, Jeff, thank you very much for participating. Sorry we had to try to keep moving things along. So,
No, that's fine.
nice having you.
Yeah.
Round of applause.